The COVID-19 pandemic has altered how work is conducted in many ways. The complete understanding of the impacts created by COVID-19 on work and organization is not yet clear. The changes that we have seen are particularly relevant to employees' ability to participate and contribute in work activities. For example, the shift from in-person to remote work affects the way that workers can communicate and share information. Participation and involvement in work processes are crucial for feeling included and productive. It is likely that changes to these practices have implications for employees' need for inclusion, as well as self-actualization. Inclusion is the extent to which workers feel that they are accepted and valued members of the organization. Work-related self-actualization regards the extent in which workers feel that they can achieve their competency and professional goals. In turn, the satisfaction of both inclusion and self-actualization are important predictors of employee attitudes and performance. We tested a hypothesis in regard to COVID-19 related changes to two critical inclusive work practices, which are having influence in decision-making and having access to information and communication. The work practices then influence the satisfaction of work-related needs for inclusion and self-actualization. This will then influence employee attitudes and behavior, specifically task performance and turnover intentions. The hypothesis tested regarded the changes related to COVID-19 to having influence in decision-making and access to information and communication. Survey data were collected from 699 Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. All participants were employed before and during COVID, at least part-time. The mean age of participants was 41, and the majority identified as female and white Euro-American. Participants responded to validated measures for workplace inclusion practices, needs satisfaction, and various outcomes, such as task performance and turnover intentions. To assess perceived changes to inclusion practices, a follow-up question was added at the end of each measure for inclusion practice, which asked participants if they perceived a change in that practice from before COVID to after COVID. The participants' responses were initially reported upon a continuous scale. The reports were then placed into one of three categories: participants who perceived no change, participants who perceived a negative change, which means that they experienced the practice less, or participants who perceived a positive change, which means that they had experienced the practice more. Only those who perceived a positive or negative change were included in the analyses. Relationships of the change variables mirror the potential differences between those who reported a negative change versus those who reported a positive change. Those who reported a negative change were coded as 0, and those who reported a positive change were coded as 1 for all analyses. The bivariate correlations between the variables within this study are consistent with our hypothesis. Positive relationships were found between both of the work practice change variables, which are decision-making influence and access to information, as well as inclusion and self-actualization, need satisfaction, and task performance. Although, we found that turnover intentions had negative relationships with all variables, though all correlations were statistically significant. To test our main hypothesis, we analyzed 4 individual models for indirect effects using process for SPSS. Each model consisted of 2 mediators: inclusion and self-actualization, need satisfaction. The models differed depending on the predictor or outcome variable. Models 1A and 1B both include the same predictor, which is change in influence in decision-making. Models 1A and 1B differ by their outcome. Model 1A includes task performance as the outcome, and Model 1B includes turnover intentions as the outcome. In Model 1, significant direct relationships were found between changes to influence in decision-making, as well as both of the mediators, which is inclusion and self-actualization, need satisfaction. Therefore, those who perceive that they have more influence in work-related decisions from before COVID to during COVID also reported feeling more included and more satisfaction within their work-related self-actualization. With regard to task performance in Model 1A, there was a direct relationship with change in influence in decision-making, but both indirect effects were not statistically significant. Inclusion and self-actualization did not mediate the relationship between changes to decision-making influence and task performance. When looking at turnover intentions in Model 1B, both indirect effects were statistically significant. Individuals who perceive that they have more influence in decision-making since before COVID-19 are less likely to leave their organization than those who perceive less influence in decision-making. This is due to the positive effect that increased decision-making influence has on inclusion and self-actualization needs. In Model 2, we examined perceived changes to access to information as the predictor of task performance and turnover intentions. The results were nearly identical to those that we had observed in Model 1. The results show that perceived changes to access to information since before COVID-19 had direct positive associations with inclusion and self-actualization needs satisfaction. With regard to task performance, we also see a direct positive association with change in access to information, but neither indirect effect was significant. We also saw a direct positive association with task performance and change in access to information, although neither of these indirect effects were significant. With turnover intentions as the outcome variable, indirect effects were shown to be significant. Individuals who perceived having more access to work-related information since before COVID-19 are less likely to leave their organization than those who perceive having less access to information since before COVID-19. Therefore, this is the result of the positive effect, which is having more access to information on inclusion and self-actualization needs satisfaction.